Welcome to the Self-Reliant Living Show, where we talk all about a self-reliant lifestyle to save money, live greener, eat healthier, and be prepared for anything so you can take care of the ones you love in good times and bad. I'm your host, Jennifer Osich, a homeschooling mom of 3 boys. I'm the author of the Preparedness Planner series, and my husband and I are the lead teachers of Self-Reliant School, a website dedicated to giving you the skills and confidence to take care of yourself and your community. Be sure to stop by and pick up your free videos from inside Self-Reliant School that will get you started growing, cooking, and preserving your own food today. You can pick these up at selfreliantschool.com/free. Now, on with the show. Okay, so welcome to the Self-Reliant Living Show. All right, yes, now we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about, is homesteading more advanced than being a prepper? So in other words, like I was just asking, or saying actually, is a homesteader a grown-up prepper? Okay, so let me just take a step back and tell you how I got to this topic. Because if you've never heard this before, you might be thinking, well, yeah, kind of, they kind of are. And it might really not, have set in yet. But it has to some people because, unbeknownst to me, this is a topic for debate. And I had never thought really too much of it myself before I did this thing that I did. So I'm not really much of a debater. I don't really get into arguing and colorful conversation on Facebook or the internet. I do have, conversations with my boys and deep conversations with friends and things like that, but not really online. And so there's that. Maybe that is something that I need to pay more attention to in the future. But anyway, I was replying to a comment and I gave a suggestion just saying that some people say that a homesteader is just a grown-up prepper. Okay, so I was met with some anger, some frustration, and rigorous debate. So in any case, let's think about this statement for a minute and really unpack it and go into some terms. And for me too, right, as I was writing these notes, I was really thinking about labels and what people call themselves and how they relate to each other. And so hopefully this will be helpful to you as well, not only as somebody who you really need to think before you type something out or speak, that goes without saying, but this goes a little bit deeper in terms of thinking about these terms and what they mean. And I think that it's just kind of a good exploration of these two different schools of thought because they are kind of different. Let me explain. Okay, so if you are talking about preparedness versus homesteading, and I'm going to get into the definition in just a second, but let's just say that for argument's sake, just right off the bat, that maybe that's true. Maybe it's true that homesteading is a more advanced way to be a prepper. Okay, now I'm going to stop every now and again and look to see if I can see the comments here because I don't want to miss anything. They were a little bit delayed, but I'm hoping that I can get to them now. Okay, so let's just think for a second about this and if this is, this is actually true. Well, if you're going to say that that is a true statement, you have to ask yourself, well, what are you preparing for? Prepared for what, right? So, right, that's the $1 million question. If we knew that, right, we could be completely prepared for whatever comes our way. And that's usually what most people say. They want to be prepared for whatever. And that is a great thing to do. But when you're talking about this statement, homesteading versus preparedness, it really does matter. What are you preparing for? And the thing is that if you are preparing for something like an economic collapse or maybe a pandemic, maybe political unrest. All of those things have different issues. And those three things in and of themselves have a lot of similarities, right? But they're going to look different if they were to happen than, something else. So the thing is that when you're talking about comparing a homesteader to a prepper, then you have to ask yourself, well, what are you preparing for, right? Okay, so all of these things, like I said, that I just mentioned, the economic collapse, the pandemic, the political unrest, they all have overlapping things that will likely happen if those things happen, right? So there will be shortages in food, and there will be people that you can't trust, and those sorts of things. Okay, so whereas if you're thinking about it, the aftermath of something like a natural disaster, like an earthquake or a volcano eruption, that would look really different than those other three things. And those three things are, even though they're related, they're still going to be different. Okay, so just having that in your mind. So usually what people do is they might have an inkling as to what they're preparing for, right? And it doesn't really even come into your conscious. It's really in your subconscious, because if you're worried, say, about a pandemic, then you're going to really make sure that you have medical preps, that you have a plan of action for a pandemic. So it's usually not even something that you're conscious of thinking about. But then, if you look at your preps and your skills, then you're going to lean one way or the other. Okay, so like I said, that's not even verbalized most of the time. So like I said, if you're concerned about a pandemic, then you're going to have things that will help you through one. So in that case, let's just take a pandemic. In that case, is being prepared more advanced than being a homesteader? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, so let's just take a step back and define some terms here. Let's define what we mean by homesteading. Okay, let's see. Yes, Misty, they do. FEMA tells everyone that you need to be ready. That is true. Okay, so let's define homesteading, right? Because it has gone through some different meanings throughout history, at least in the last several hundred years. Okay, so, and it's a little tricky because the definition has changed. So in the 1800s, there was the Homestead Act of 1862, actually, and that was where a settler could go and get land, somebody that didn't have money to purchase it. If they were to live on that land for a certain amount of time, then they could own that land. The deed would be awarded to them. So that's kind of where the idea of having this land came from, at least in the US. Okay, then in the 1960s and 70s, before my time, there was a movement that was sort of back to the land, so there was, a feeling of everything was so commercialized, and that, we were losing touch with our history, our ancestors. So there was a movement, kind of a hippie type of live off the land sort of movement. And so that was another sort of definition that creeped up, that if you homestead, that's what you do. You live off the land. Okay, so nowadays, that hasn't been as long ago as, say, the 1800s, but that sort of movement has morphed into a more of a self-reliance view. So if you're homesteading and you make a stance and you say, I choose to homestead, then it sort of has a self-reliance type of meaning to it. So that's kind of the journey of the word homesteading and how it's sort of morphed into meaning self-reliance now. Okay, so now let's talk about preparedness and what that means and where that came from. So preparedness is a relatively new term, and it comes from the Cold War. in terms of people being encouraged to seek out fallout shelters and stockpile food in those shelters, or just stockpile food if you couldn't afford to have a fallout shelter. And it's generally kind of a derogatory term. I think that some people have owned it and we're taking hold of it and we're saying, no, this is really a good thing. And it is. The thing is, I think it's sad that basically a prepper is a practical person, right? Because keeping a 72-hour kit is a really good idea. Knowing emergency procedures is a really good idea. And then even if you go a little further than that and you have a bug out bag, and then you maybe even have a bug out location scoped out, that's a really good idea. So I think that what has happened is we have been labeled, people needed something to call us, right? And they're calling us a prepper, but I think really it's a practical person. Okay, so let's think about this though, in terms of is this a good idea, right? Because I'm saying that being a prepper is a pretty good idea. Is homesteading a pretty good idea? Let's think about that for just a second. Okay, and I'm monitoring comments. Okay, Kelly says in her mind, prepper and homesteader are almost interchangeable. If you are a homesteader, you are a prepper, but if you are a prepper, you are not necessarily a homesteader. Okay, so most preppers are using MREs and number 10 cans and such, whereas homesteaders prepare with their own food growing and preparing it and canning it. Yes. Okay, but let's talk about if that's a practical good idea to be a homesteader. And there are some people who think it's just perfectly fine to go live on an island or up in a mountain and never talk to anyone. They're just kind of loners. They want to be by themselves. Maybe they have a family, maybe not. But that's not really most people. Most people actually need to be part of a community because we're human and that's how we're designed. And for good reason, because it's really, really hard to make it on your own. So even though that it's a good idea to have a garden if you can, it's a really good idea maybe to have some backyard chickens if you can. It's not practical for everybody. You have to do, obviously what you can where you are, and that's fine. So having a small plot of land that can sustain a garden and that has some water resources on it and has a tight-knit community, is that something to aspire to? Yeah, it's not a bad thing, but the thing is that it might not be the thing that everyone can do. So let's talk about that a little more. And then I should say, because we're talking about preparedness, and is preparedness a good idea? Yeah, it's a good idea in terms of, being prepared for an emergency. Now, like I said, some would argue that it's just another name for people who sort of move against that instant gratification and done for you mentality that we have. And then, of course, I can't talk about preparedness, right, without talking about doomsday preppers and people that really take it to an extreme. And so that is part, I think, of the reason that the word prepper has also kind of a negative connotation, is because of the origin of the word, and then also the media has taken it and sort of run with it, right, with that negative connotation. And so we have these labels. Okay, so in reality, the thing is that these two things, based on their definition and based on the origin of how they emerged, they do have different meanings. Okay, so, but they do have some similarities. So the similarities are the desire to take care of yourself and your community, right? So both sort of schools of thought have that mentality. They want to take care of themselves and not rely on the government or other entities. Just throw that out there. They both have a feeling that something in our society is just not quite right. So they're either trying to get away from it by moving away from it, or they are, just putting some things aside, learning a few things here and there just in case, because they just have this unsettling feeling. And then I think that both homesteaders and preppers have this sense that the path to a good future is not along the current path. I mean, it kind of goes along with there's some unsettling feelings, but I think it goes a little bit further, and even that there's kind of, there's a belief that we're just not on the right track, and it's going to change at some point, some way, somehow. Not sure what or how, but the thing is that there's that feeling again. So I think there's the similarities to both homesteaders and preppers, and that should be recognized for sure. But I still think that there are differences in the two terms. And so we ask, we come to the question of, should a prepper be a homesteader? Is that something that you should really aspire to? Is homesteading a grown-up form of preparedness? Okay, so let me see what some people are saying here. Okay, so Jennifer says food, water, health, safety. I would call that thinking practically. Yes, being a prepper is a very practical, good idea. And it is just so sad that, like I said, it does have that negative connotation. But people, I think, have just been looking for a label for practical people, and they didn't want to say practical people, which is really sad. But anyway, I totally agree. But back to the question. If you're a prepper and you are moving along in your journey, you're learning skills, you're building up your preps, the right preps, and you know how to use them, should you buy land? Is that your next step? Okay, so, well, maybe, but maybe not. So let's talk about it a little bit more. So let's go back to that pandemic scenario. Okay, so if there was a pandemic, are you safer on a homestead than you would be, say, in a suburban area or even in an urban area? Are you safer? Do you think that because you live on a homestead that you would be unaffected by the pandemic? Well, it just depends, right? It always depends on people, and it always depends on the situation. But the thing is that, let's just say all things being equal, and would a homesteader or a prepper who's not on a homestead come out in the ahead? Which one would come out ahead? So in the comments, tell me which one you think would come out ahead if that were the case. And then I'm just going to go ahead and tell you what I think, but go ahead and tell me in the comments so we can talk about this, because your opinion might be different than mine. Okay, so in the beginning, I don't know, a homesteader may have a few advantages because there's not as many people, and we all know that a pandemic usually is spread with close contact with other humans. So that's possible. So in the beginning, I think that a homestead might be a little safer. They may have a little bit more time to process what's going on. They may be able to look at some things that are going on in the city and then anticipate what's going to happen next. But honestly, in this particular scenario, they're both going to be affected. And the homesteader is maybe going to have an advantage for a little while, maybe a couple of weeks, depends on the situation, right? But, let's just say, like I said, all things being equal, maybe for a couple of weeks. But then they're going to be at a disadvantage because people are going to be seeking food, seeking medicine, seeking space, because of pandemic. People are going to want to put space between themselves and other people. So the thing is that it doesn't matter really if you're a homesteader or a prepper in that situation, you're going to have some hard days to get through. And it just depends on, if you're a prepper, what your preps are. If you have a different location to go to, if you have the right supplies, if you have the right knowledge, if you have all of those things compared to maybe a homesteader that hasn't prepared for a pandemic, maybe they're growing their own food and all of those sorts of things, but that's going to look really attractive to people who are seeking food. So in that situation, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. I mean, hopefully the homesteader has prepared for a lot of things, and hopefully the homesteader's both, right? A prepper and a homesteader. But just having that plot of land isn't really going to make a huge difference in that scenario. Okay, so now I'm going to look and see if you guys are telling me which ones that you think would be. Yeah, it depends on the person. It does. It depends on the person. It depends on the situation. It really does. Okay. But just like I said, all things being equal, there's going to be hard days for both to live through, homesteaders and preppers. And one may have an advantage at some time, and then the other may have an advantage a little bit later on down the road. Okay. So now, if you're one of those preppers that thinks that there's going to be a major shift in the coming days, like I do, a shift back to sustainability, to local community, things like that, that we need to revive traditions that have been lost in recent generations, and then that, then that's something to think about, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go and buy a plot of land. Okay, what does it, it doesn't mean if you don't have land, that doesn't mean that you're really even not a homesteader, because the actual definition, dictionary definition, we talked about how the word evolved, but the actual dictionary definition just means that homestead is your home and the land that your home is on, and then any other buildings that are on that land. So that is your homestead. So you can be a homesteader if you're in a suburban area, even in an apartment, because if you're taking care of your surroundings, you're a homesteader. That is basically what it boils down to. So I think that instead of asking somebody or even stating, well, a homesteader is just a grown-up prepper, I think it's better to say that, or ask the question, is a person who owns and works land, are they a grown-up prepper? So just because you have land, just because you work it, and you have a garden and maybe some livestock, does that make you a grown-up prepper? Maybe. It depends, right? So let's talk about some of the things that it depends on. Okay. Carla is saying she wants a small homestead to be self-reliant. Okay, so there's even another term, self-reliant. I love that. Okay, but let's go back to this question. Does owning and working on land, does that make you a grown-up prepper? And so let's talk about that for a second. It depends. It really depends. So here are some of the things it depends on. What are you prepping for? Right? So we already talked about having a homestead, and that it probably wouldn't give you a huge advantage, like say in the pandemic scenario that we were talking about. Okay. Now, if you are helping your children prepare for a world that you see is going to be very different in their future, and you want to raise them on land and teach them skills, that's a different story. But that's a prepper too, right? So that's a different story. But in terms of something that is just going to overtake us, like a disastrous situation, like a pandemic, erupting volcano, a civil unrest, political unrest, all of those things that would probably move pretty fast, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference whether you are a homesteader or whether you are well prepared where you are. Okay, here's another thing that it depends on. What stage of life are you in? It's not really practical for somebody who is elderly and has limited mobility to go out and work a bunch of land. Now, if your whole family is there and there's, the younger generation to do some of the harder labor, and then, you do some of the planning because you're the elder, then that's a different story. But if it's just somebody who's older and, like I said, limited mobility, that's not really a practical thing for them. But does that mean that they're any less of a prepper? Another situation would be a younger person who maybe has just gotten out of college, maybe has just gotten out of a trade school, and they want to spend some years working in their trade. And maybe it's not farming. I mean, if it was farming, that was a different story. But even if it is farming, you need to be around other people, other farmers. I know that depending on what your specialty is in agriculture, you may need to visit different farms and different parts of the country, that sort of thing. So if you want to spend some time working in your trade, owning land at that time in your life might not be the best thing for you. And so it just really depends on the stage of your life. What stage of life are you in? And just because you are younger and, like I said, want to work in your trade, does that mean that you're less of a prepper? Okay. Here's another thing. What do you want for yourself? Not everybody is cut out to go and raise livestock or have a garden. It takes a certain amount of temperament to work with animals. There's a certain amount of expertise that you need for gardening. I mean, I always say gardening is the simplest thing in the world to do and the hardest thing, right? So it's a learning experience, and to be a master gardener, it takes a lifetime. But then, you can put a seed in the ground and watch it grow. But the thing is, that's not everybody's thing. There's other things that people can do to contribute to a tight-knit community besides gardening or raising livestock. So it really just depends on what you want for yourself. And because you're not that type of person, does that mean that you're less of a prepper? Okay. So here's another one. What do you want for your community? How do you want to contribute to your community? Do you want to contribute to your community? Because some homesteaders are like, no, just leave me alone. I've got me and mine, and I am raising my own stuff. But the thing is, like we talked about just a minute ago, that if you are one of those people, then, that's not the norm. Most people need community. Community is a good thing when people work together. And so the thing is that if you live in a rural part of the country, then it might be harder to make ties in your community because it's, there's a greater distance. I mean, you could get lucky and get into a really tight tight-knit community where you are if you live in a rural area. But sometimes that's not possible for whatever reason. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that it might not be possible, but, the thing is that there are other ways to contribute to a community and bring community together. And generally, the work is needed in the areas of the city and suburbia where people haven't been doing that for a long time and need to. So does that make you less of a prepper? Okay. So, and then here's another one, and we touched on this just a second ago. Well, what do you want for your children, right? So do you want them to go to school? And usually, you go to school in an urban environment. I know there's online classes and things like that, and you could certainly do that. But at some point, you need to actually be either in a classroom or in the learning situation, whether that's a lab or whatever the case may be. So if you're living in a rural area, that is more difficult. It's more difficult to get your kids to those activities, those functions, that learning environment. So those are some things to think about. And does any of those things make you less prepared for what's going to happen? So I'm going to look at some of these comments here because I know they're probably going wild. Okay. Okay. Local is always best. Yes. I think you have to be selected who you let into your circle if you choose to work with others. Yeah, Mandy, that is true. That is really true. And then building a tight-knit community is difficult sometimes. Like I said, when you live in a remote area, sometimes the community won't let you in. Sometimes, people don't think like you do, and it's hard to be part of a community where things have already been established and there's no new thinking, there's that sort of thing. Sometimes people get really lucky and those remote communities are just wonderful. And, I hope that if anyone is considering moving out to a rural location, that is what they are met with. But sometimes, I've heard a lot of stories, sometimes that's not the case. So yeah, with community, you really have to be careful and you have to be selective, and the only way to be selective is to have a selection in front of you, right? So there is that concern. Okay, so I think we've come to a conclusion, right? I've come to the conclusion after I said that initially. So owning land is not necessarily the answer to being an advanced prepper. I really don't think that. And I wish that I had thought through that when I had said it, because the two terms really are different. And it depends on, who you're talking to, because like I said, they do have some overlapping points of view and some things that they believe together. But if we're really just talking about owning land versus somebody else who wants to be prepared for whatever, and they do that with learning skills, they do that with having the right things around them to help them do those skills, I really don't think that that's the case. I really don't think that a homesteader is just a grown-up prepper. I really think that's a false statement. So the thing is, like I said, they're two different terms. I think really what should be said is that having traditional skills, working on those traditional skills, having a plan are the way that you become an advanced prepper. Because if you are a beginning prepper, you're probably really focused on things, gathering things. Well, I'm going to need this and I'm going to need that. But understanding in the end that stuff is not going to save you. It's the skills, it's the planning, it's the right things, right? Because you have to plan to have the right things around you and know how to use them. That is going to be what is going to set you apart from others, and hopefully put you in a position where you can help others, right? If something were to happen. Okay, so I think that is a little bit more wordy than a homesteader, a grown-up prepper. I think all those things are a little bit harder to say, and it's not as catchy a phrase, right? But I think it's more true. And I think that also it is really getting to the heart of the matter in terms of preparedness and people thinking negative about people who have preps or are preparedness minded, in that we're just practical, right? And I think that we all have, like I said, an unsettling feeling, hopefully for no reason at all. Hopefully there will be nothing that happens. But if you're like me, you think that over time there's going to be a shift in the way that this society comes together and in the way business is done, then that's the reason to bring back some of these traditional skills that have been almost eliminated. And so, and to know when to use them, how they make you healthier, and how they make your life better is so, so important. Okay, so That is not, like I said, as catchy a phrase, but like I said, I think it is more accurate. Okay, so let me look here. And I have a lot of comments here talking about this. And if I don't get to your comment, I am going to go back through all the comments, so rest assured. Oh, here's one Shelley is talking about. You cannot learn everything. That is a great point. And she says, but gathering friends who know things is one of the best ways to be more prepared for everything. Oh my gosh, that is just such an excellent statement, and I love it. That sums up the whole community aspect of it, and that no man should be an island. I love that. Thank you, Shelley, for commenting and telling everybody that, sharing that. Okay, so I want to let you know that preparedness obviously is on my mind. And I have been thinking about it for a while. We actually, Self-Reliant School started out as a preparedness block. We have a lot of things on our site that talk about preparedness. And so we are very preparedness oriented. And so over this week, obviously with this show and then next week's show, we're going to be talking about preparedness. And I have even designed a 9-day preparedness challenge. And I would love for you guys to sign up for that, and so that you can get emails. And this time I think we're going to do some videos as well. So we'll be delivering the challenge through email and some videos. And then we'll just really get into what it means to be an advanced prepper and to, to really feel good about what we're doing in terms of community and some things that I might challenge you to do in this challenge. So you can go to selfreliantschool.com/prepper to sign up for that. And I hope that you do. It's going to be 9 days. It will start on Monday. So go ahead and sign up for that, and you'll get like a welcome email. And then after that, we will start the challenge. And so I look forward to talking with you through that challenge. Like I said, there's going to be some videos with this challenge and some email. So I really, really am excited about it. So with that being said, remember that being self-reliant isn't just about you. It's about you taking care of yourself so you can take care of the ones that you love. Take care until we talk again. I'm so glad you could join me today. Here's what to do next. Head over to selfreliantlife.tv to pick up the show notes for this episode and to watch replays of older episodes. To go directly to the show notes for this episode, go to selfreliantlife.tv, and then without a space, type a / and then the number of today's episode. You can watch this show live every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific, live on Facebook or the Periscope app. Don't forget to stop by selfreliantschool.com/free to get your free Self-Reliant School videos that will help you get started living a self-reliant life. Also, if you're listening to this show as a podcast and you've liked what you've heard today, please subscribe through Stitcher, iTunes, or your favorite podcast app. If you're on a mobile device, just search for the Self-Reliant Living Show. If you're on a laptop or desktop, just go to selfreliantlife.tv/iTunes. And while you're there, please leave a review. I love to hear from you. You leaving feedback makes it easier for others that are interested in living a self-reliant life to find my podcast. Take care until we talk again.